Good evening. I'm Liza Posas, the head of Research Services and Archives at the Autry Museum of the American West. First, I would like to acknowledge the traditional caretakers of this land, the Gabrielino Tongva people. I would also like to thank the Autry's generous donors and members for making this program happen. I'm honored, along with the Board of Trustees, to welcome you to the Artist Conversations. The exhibition the exhibition What's Her Story? Women in the Archives and this artist conversation are made possible with support from the California Humanities, a nonprofit partner of the National Endowment of the Humanities. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of the California Humanities or the National Endowment of the Humanities. Before we go any further, I would also like to mention that if you have questions during our conversation, please enter them at any time in the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom window. The Autry of the American West represents something slightly different to each of you who visits us physically and virtually. And today we will be discussing a project that took full advantage of the virtual realm as we had to adjust from a pre-March 2020 world to a post-March 2020 world. Joining me today are members of Versos y Besos, UCLA professor of English and Chicana studies, Dr. Marissa Lopez, Susie Garcia, band director of Los Colibri, Dr. Amy Shimshon-Santo, poet, Janice Ngan, co-founder of Art in Residence, and Britt Campbell, manager of public programs at the Autry. Marissa, Amy, Susie, Janet, and Britt, thank you for joining us today. In a bit, I will be asking you, each of you, to share your role in this collective project, which the full name is Versos y Besos, the anthrophony, the anthrophony of Manuela Garcia. But before we begin, I do want to point out that the What's Her Story? Women in the Archives exhibit tries to accomplish a few things. So Rob, can you show the first slide? One, having something that celebrates the spirit of the women's suffrage movement and the 100th centennial of women winning the right to vote. And two, revealing women's stories from found in the Autry's archive collections. And three, how discoverable a story can be is related to the archive, not only how it's created, but also its long range custodianship, which is where institutions like the Autry, UCLA, the Los Angeles Public Library, and the like usually come in. And I particularly mention those institutions because we had to work with all of them to bring together the story of Manuela Garcia. So in some cases, you have creators of archives and the main subject of the archives intrinsically tied to one another, such as the Assistance League of Los Angeles Archives, or the Native Voices Theater Ensemble Archives, or the Carolyn Boeing Poole Papers and the Gladys Knight Harris Papers, which are all featured in the What's Her Story exhibit. And in other cases, more footwork is needed in creating a story by bringing different archives together, such as the case with the first Native American woman archaeologist, Bertha Parker Cody, and the woman we'll be featuring today, Manuela Garcia. Manuela Garcia is known before this project and before the What's Her Story exhibit was pretty much known in broad strokes, and she was most known for being Charles Fletcher Lummis's most valuable informant when it came to building his recordings of Spanish folk songs. Garcia recorded approximately 120 wax cylinder recordings for Lummis, mostly in 1904 and 1905, and her songs make up more than 1/3 of the Spanish language songs in the Lummis collection. And Rob, you can keep this slide, just stay right here. But with the research and resources created for the What's Her Story exhibit and the Versos y Besos projects, we can say much more about Manuela. And I hope you had a chance to read this particular slide and the comment that came from Delia Chavez, the Mexican Secretary of Culture. So on your left is a notebook page. It's actually Manuela Garcia's handwritten notebook where she wrote lyrics to 149 Spanish songs, and this is the first page, Versos del Alba. And I think what the Mexican Secretary of Culture says is really striking, that she says, that this was an emasculated song, but in finding out this engaging with this archival piece, that it reveals the invisible part of the history that's related to the feminine. so that is like the first major discovery of Manuel C. Garcia, or what we unearthed. And then from that, a number of things came. So before this project, before the exhibit, it really was this one for particular image that we have of Manuela Garcia. And then that's at the Autry. And then we have the wax cylinder recordings of her songs, which are now posted on the Internet Archive. I'm kind of going clockwise here. And then the beautiful handwritten ledger are her records from the UCLA Normal School. And down below to the bottom right is the Mapping Manuela project that Marissa put together that opened up more of Manuela's story when she did research in the Los Angeles Public Library. One is finding, getting the birth and death, the death certificate of Manuela that provided her death date, which eventuality also led us to confirm that the recordings that she's in are in public domain, or all the recordings are in public domain. And then LAPL also created this wonderful coloring page of Manuela, based again, I'm sure influenced by Marissa's research. So now that I've given you a bit of a teaser of what's been discovered, I'm going to turn to the panel to tell you more about this project, starting with Janice, with possible like interjections from Brittany Campbell. So Janice, please tell us more about how this project originated and how it started.
Yeah, hi everybody. It's been a privilege and an honor to work alongside everyone, and I am so happy to be sharing the story with all of you. I'm actually serving as a curator for this project. I was first invited by Britt, and I sort of, I guess, serve as a co-producer for the collective that I then created, which you'll get to know, and you'll get to know everybody more as we continue forward with this conversation.
Yeah, I would only say a little bit of background. I created a series at the Autry in 2018 called Autry After Hours to try to center storytellers in a museum space. I am always looking for ways to better embed community-driven research, public engagements, curatorial inquiry, and archival storytelling. So come 2020, I thought, what if I took myself out as the driver's seat and stopped booking these storytellers myself, and kind of gave it to someone else. And Janice was one of 3 LA thought leaders I tapped to curate her own collective. And now we're here.
So I'll go continually to the other members of the collective. So Amy, what was your role in this project?
My role began as a designated poet to write a poem about Manuela Garcia, but when we started, we didn't know, all we knew is that she was a quote unquote informant for someone else's story. It's for Loomis. And so I ended up becoming the co-conspirator and honeybee connector that that brought in Jasmine Morales, who brought in Susie Garcia, that connected to Annie Boyadian from the LAPL, that ended up connecting us to Marissa. And so that's kind of how that worked.
Great. And Marissa, since you were mentioned, you'll be next.
I'm Marissa. I teach at UCLA. I'm a professor of English and Chicano studies. And last year I was on sabbatical working at the Los Angeles Public Library. And Ani was my supervisor there. She's head of research and special collections. So when this team reached out to the library looking for images, more images of Manuela, or any more material related to Manuela, she reached out to me because my project at the library was to I'm building a mobile app that will display images of 19th century Mexican Los Angeles to users. So she asked if I had found any images, and I did a little poking around and I couldn't find anything. And then I was like, ooh, but this sounds really fun. And so I reached out to Britt and Janice. So I don't have what you're looking for, but I'm super interested in this project. Is there anything else that I can do, any way that I can contribute? And that is how I wound up participating and being the designated technology person.
I forgot to mention Delia Sochi Chavez. We should honor her since she's not actually here in the room, but she was another connection we made to look at the song hemispherically. I just wanted to speak her name.
And I should also say that this is an international effort because it's another great silver lining of all of this, right? We can bring people from different parts of the globe. Susie.
Hi, good evening.
Hi.
Well, my participation really centered around bringing Manuela's lyrics to life, you know, in a sense. And also though, in hearing more about her and getting the background that Janice and Britt presented was, and Amy, of course, to really put it all together for me, it was figuring out the parallels in our lives and seeing how two women in Los Angeles, growing up in Los Angeles from the very beginning with Mexican American roots, could have so many things in common and really deeply rooted in their passion for music. So that was just like the motivational force of my participation, that started at really simple as just, performing the music. But then I got sucked into the fact that this is so exciting and how I can see myself in Manuela, and we'll talk about that a little later.
Great, thank you. So the first question I wanted to ask is just the name of your collaborative. Who came up with that and how did that come about?
That was on a very late night call between Hong Kong and Los Angeles with Britt and Janice and I going over the summary. We finally realized it was time for us to create a new summary language, and we'd had access to the cover of the journal, and we decided to focus on her journal for a moment versus the recordings, because we wanted to get that first direct, the lines and markings of the artist herself. And the first editorial mark that she makes is that line. Versos, she writes besos de alba, which to me look like besos de luta, but it says alba, just it's kind of borrado. And so it showed us so much about her. One, it sounds beautiful. Besos y versos, kisses and verses, that's poetry. Also, it shows us her handwriting, her impeccable handwriting that became kind of the key to unlock a lot of these relationships. And also she's spelling and making an editorial mark between her two languages. Because actually besos y versos sounds pretty much the same in Spanish, but it's spelled differently. So we wanted to lead with her mark, her editorial mark, and her titling. And
then anthrophony. This who came up?
Anthrophony's John, our sound recording person, had given us these audio tapes that we could listen to imagine the soundscape that Janice wanted us to conjure. And we learned that the world of sound is an anthrophony.
Beautiful. Amy, can you say the whole project name? I'm sure you could say it so much more lyrically than I can.
Besos y versos, the anthrophony of Manuela Garcia.
Said like a true poet. And lyricism is something that I found throughout when I was reading your works and listening to your soundscape. And so, Janice, I'll start off questions with you. Also, I just want to remind anybody that if you have in the audience, if you have questions, feel free to type them in at any moment in the Q&A section in the bottom of your Zoom window, I guess it is. But Janice, so you were the first one brought on. So what were your first impressions, and what prompted you to create the different components of the collaborative like you did?
Yeah, absolutely. So when Britt first invited me to curate part of the Autry After Hours, I knew that I wanted to work with relational aesthetics, which is actually a term that describes the tendency to make art based on or inspired by human relations and their social context. I wanted to establish a new way to look at and share artistic experiences, to create humanizing moments through art without the need of capturing it through a screen, which we are doing now. And also, on Instagram, different social platforms every day, we want to repost moments in our lives because as humans, we're inclined to share an experience with another person because it amplifies the experience for both people. But if you're sharing that with someone else other than the person that you're with, that actually detracts the value from your partner's perspective. And that brings me to music, using music as a tool to generate empathy. Music is something that Britt and I connected deeply over the first time that we met. And that lands us on Manuela Garcia's music. When I first learned about Manuela, it was actually through the Charles Loomis Wax Cylinder collection, which I found didn't really tell us much about Manuela, her life, or her story, except for Loomis's point of view in capturing archaeology alive by recording Spanish folk songs, while those that knew the songs were still around to sing them. And as you mentioned earlier, Manuela was one of his most frequently used informants. She sang about 100 songs that he recorded. And my initial plans for an in-person program was actually an immersive experience where I would pair a spoken word performance with directional speakers that played different songs Manuela sang. Audiences could only hear these sounds through the speakers depending on where they physically stood in relation to the speakers. So that played on the idea that different histories will only be known to those who were at the right place in the right time and recorded accordingly. So when COVID hit, I had to shift to a digital format, and hence the creation of this binaural soundscape by my collective. It started out with inviting Amy, our poet, to interpret the wax cylinders and write about Manuela through hearing her voice. After that, as I tried to find my way through the shift to virtual, I was shared this music file of a song where you had to put on headphones to listen to. And the song played in 3D style, where you got to really like feel the music, which I think Susie will expand on later. And I think this file was shared many times with others after that as a remedy to the mass cancellation of live music festivals. And it brought me so much joy to listen to it as LA was going through a lockdown and I was transported to this immersive listening experience while I was in quarantine. So this brings us to the other part of our collective with my dear friend John from Aurelia Soundworks, who specializes in immersive 3D sound for VR, film, gaming, installation. And from working with and learning from him, I came to the idea of creating this auditory experience that people could listen to while they're quarantining at home that made them feel like they were in the museum space experiencing it. And this experience would incorporate Amy's spoken word storytelling performance, featuring live recorded music that was mixed with Manuela's century-old wax cylinder recordings. And in the journey to tell her story, we only had a few pieces of materials to work with since there was no access to the archive. We had pictures of the wax cylinders. I think we had a check that Loomis wrote to Manuela, some letter correspondences that were shared between them, and a picture of her notebook, which we saw in the beginning of the presentation, and literally the first page of that. And that brings us to Susie from Las Colibri, our collective's mariachi, who interpreted that first page and adapted the lyrics to a melody that she created. And with the lack of access, Amy had the idea to connect us with the LA Public Library to further our research and finding out more about Manuela, possibly through their special collections. And with that partnership, we were gifted Marissa, who is a scholar in residence there and who pioneered our interactive digital map that pinpointed various locations that Manuela is a part of, including her home on Olive Street, which now is LA's Chinatown, and her work as a bookkeeper at the Singer Sewing Machine, the LA Business College, where the LA Times actually reported Manuela's receiving her degree in 1889, in addition to many other locations accompanied by Manuela's relevance to them and their parts of LA's history.
Thank you. That's amazing. And honestly, when Britt started talking to me about this project and the focus on Manuela, with each revelation and each layer of stories that you were able to pluck from the archives or critiques that were able to come out, I was just amazed. The next question is Marissa, and I kind of asked you this previously, but I'm going to try to paraphrase in your essay about Manuela in regards to technology. So you were, like you said, the designated technology, and your role was to think about the deployment of technology. And one of the questions you posed, which struck to me, was how the expansive and trans-historical ways that technology can be used and the different means to simultaneously, especially for women of color, simultaneously amplify and silence the story. I hope I got the paraphrase right. So my ultimate question is, like, after doing this project, how do these essential questions that you asked in the beginning, or how did your answer maybe change after seeing the final outcome of the overall project?
Ooh.
Yeah, I don't even know what I asked you in a little bit. So
take that as an invitation to say interesting things. but I mean, it's a great question that you pose, because it's still an open question, because I think this work is still ongoing, and I will say I'm not entirely sure. So that's where we're going to end. I'm not sure. Then we'll circle back to the beginning. When I came into this collective, the work was already churning and things were already happening. So I had to do a lot of catch up and figure out, what everybody was talking about, and, what were the salient points and the big issues. And so I came into this thinking like, all right, I want to understand what everybody is doing and understand like, how can we amplify, to use my quote, to quote you quoting me, how can we amplify this work? How can we, how can I use my skill set to bring this story, into different spaces? And so I had been working on this app for LA Public Library, and I had written a bit about technology, and kind of in various ways, and kind of Latinx futurism. So I was like, all right, so I'm going to continue this thinking with Manuela. Interesting. It's an overused word, but interesting to me is that we have Manuela, and all the traces that we have of her are through these different mediums, like different technologies make her visible to us. Technologies of writing with paper and pen. We have a typewriter. We have technologies of finance, as Janice mentioned earlier. We have checks, or a check at least, that Lemus wrote to her, and we have different recording technologies. And so all these different technologies combine to make Manuela very visible to us in the archive, and yet, we learn from, Roland Barthes on photography, the great theorizer of photography, like a picture or an archival object. A picture is both itself and something more, right? The picture is both the thing, the image, but then it's also an event, right? And we don't have access to that event, right? You see an image, and you know that there's a world happening outside the frame of that image, right? There's a photographer, there's something, there's things outside the frame, but we don't have access to that. We just know that it's there. So it's a very present absence. So similarly, we have all these instances of Manuela, but we hear her singing, but we hear her singing the songs that Lomas wanted to record. We don't hear her singing. We don't have any access to the music that she might have listened to with her friends. So this was part of my initial challenge, was to figure out what technologies we had available to access a Manuela outside the archive. So that was my first challenge. And so, we had the material from the Autry, and then I just hit the pavement and tried various kind of traditional, tedious, boring methods of archival research. I searched newspaper databases, I searched census records, I searched birth and death records, to come up with all these different points that we could put Manuela. So I used all kinds of digital technology to unearth and put together an image of Manuela that exists outside of Lemus's archive, right? So that picture, as you see it in the map, and that map is part of our publication, our cluster publication on ASAPJ that's online. We can provide the link to our viewers. So I just lost the thread of what I was saying, honestly. It's been a long day. But so those different locations, those maps, give us a really different woman than just, the woman who sang songs for Lemus. This is a woman who had parties that were reported on in the newspaper, right? Who came from a family that had a certain amount of social standing. Like, her father shows up a lot in the LA Herald and the LA Times. He was a trustee of the Spanish American Benevolent Society, a mutual aid society, community organization in the early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century, who, her family was a presence. She did things and they showed up in the paper. And so that was really, that's a powerful thing to know. And so technology makes that possible, right? So technology makes her visible in all kinds of different ways, but even as it makes it visible, we have to always recognize that there's so much that we can't see. And that's that's frustrating, but it's something that we have to always keep in mind when working with this material. So, and similarly, so these are the technologies that make her visible. But then in thinking about, we also had to think about the technologies that we had at our disposal to make Manuela visible in these different ways, right? So a conversation that we've had a lot is, questions around access, right? So I could use software to make this interactive map, but it's kind of a flat and static map that you have to look at on a computer, right? So I had to pivot or try to pivot to think about like what were the different ways that we could put this map, make it GIS enabled, and kind of make it accessible on people's smartphones, because we know that minority populations, and especially Latinx populations, access the internet more commonly on smartphones than they do on kind of static devices like laptops. So there's like a whole range of deep existential questions that technology, which feels so simple, but it's like a Pandora's box of both opportunities and problems. So that's what I've been thinking about these last few months with this amazing team of inspiring thinkers.
Right. I mean, I think this collective has really prompted me to think a lot about who Manuela was, and be able to fill her out as a human, as a person, and not just as an informant. One of the things that struck home to me was actually in the soundscape. So one of the culminating projects is this 15-minute soundscape, which we will provide the link to at the end of this conversation. And it was the part of the soundscape in particular that let you be a fly on the wall right before Los Colibri was about to, or I think it was during the rehearsal. It must have been during the rehearsal or when they were about to sing the song. But I believe it's you, Susie, that called Manuela a godmother, kind of a godmother figure. And that, for some reason, it just, because in my culture, godmothers are a big deal too. And so that just sort of fully made the picture for me. And then I'd like to share the other element I'd like to share in the soundscape is, Rob, if you can cue up the soundscape portion of their conversation about the translation of a word.
The lyrics are sweet. So nácar, did you guys know what that is? Nácar? No. It's the mother of pearl. Inside the pearl? That's what nácar is. Like whatever you see inside the shell. Yeah. Oh, that makes so much sense.
But I know it from the beauty products. The beauty product Concha nácar?
Yeah. That's probably where you're gonna take crema. The willow tree and the palma, like they sway back and forth with calm, and that their leaves on the trees, they have this look of mother of pearl and azul, blue. So like when you think of that, it's like, oh yeah, like at night as they're swaying, that's what they look like. It's the swaying, and that's what the sound, how beautiful the sound of the sauce la palma swaying back and forth. And alma de mi alma, the metaphor of a person. That's how beautiful you are. Yeah. Oh, I just got chills.
I love that. I love ending with I just got chills, because that is, we've talked about in the previous conversation we had, we've talked about the luminosity of archives. And as an archivist, I would think, as an archivist, one of the big, points, or one of the big rewards for us, is to see that engagement and how it affects you as the person. And so that's why I just was really it gravitated towards that clipping. So I just wanted to ask, like, how, basically, I just want to open it up to you, Susie, to talk about that moment and how, like, that engagement, how that felt for you and your music and with your group.
Now, it was a moment after we played the song, actually. We were
okay.
on the music so much before we got there, practicing and making this good, because it was a live recording. So we had to sort of be as perfect as possible in these takes. That's hard to do, a live recording anytime. It's going to last forever somewhere in an archive.
Right.
Good. So we did that, and then we got to talk about it afterwards. And there's two pieces to this I think everybody should know, or that, when you sing a music like mariachi, which is oral tradition, it's just songs passed down over years and years and years. As a young person, you're hearing a version and it's ingrained in your brain, because somebody taught it to you that way, and that's how you've heard a recording. And a whole different version of this song was already programmed in our brains, every single one of us. So, el sauce le palma se mecen con calma, sus hojas se visten de una cara azul. That is a whole different meaning. It's a whole different, it's like, it doesn't even almost make sense. So learn songs, even as a little kid, like that nursery rhymes that sometimes you don't, were they really intended, those words, you know, or did they just sound like that? And that's how we ended up learning them. So it was really a moment for all of us to think, wow, like, look how much of a difference, a poetic, real difference, a voice was lost or was stripped from this piece of music, and how sad on one end, and you know, how interesting that passing maybe borders from Los Angeles to Mexico back over, that we lost something. And that happens to culture, that happens to people, values. It's just like a parallel. And that's what like was the, oh, I got chills. Oh, I have this, we all had a real crazy moment of, oh, and what is our responsibility as musicians now that we know the true version? So do we go back? Now I can't even sing that other version. It's like, I can't even do it. It doesn't feel right. It doesn't make sense to me now that I really, as a musician should, and it's a lesson for a musician to say, look at what you're doing, listen to what you're saying. What message are you spreading? And I think that something I did want to talk about too, I just mentioned the parallel of, Delia said in the beginning, this was kind of stolen from a woman. Her voice was stripped completely. Was that intentional? Maybe not. But we still have to think about it and say, that's a parallel of society too. What has been stripped of women for many, many years of their voice. So this whole collective and this exhibition is important, because what is our story? What do we have to tell? And what can we share with the world? And now I have a responsibility when I sing that song on stage, because I have a platform with Las Colibri to introduce this song. That's the first thing I'm going to talk about. Yes, there's a woman out there that possibly wrote this song, even though she interpreted it from another poem, right, from Spain, and really put that in focus for people, because that's why oral tradition and mariachi music is recognized by UNESCO and all, these big organizations, to say culture and everything. It's not just mariachi music with tequila and, tacos. This is like real poetry and music that is important. And what Marissa said, we don't even have everything because it's sitting in the archives in the museum that we can't see. So I want to say that I didn't create the melody that is played for El Salsa de la Palma. That's actually something that's traditional, that mariachi has been playing that song for a long time. So we don't know if it's the original melody, but we use that melody and adapted it to her lyrics, which I think is still suitable and very fair. Yeah. So, but it's exciting, and the girls really had this moment, that we were excited, and it's nice to be excited about music that for many musicians becomes monotonous, like, oh, they asked for that song again,
Yeah. Yeah, that like connectivity. I definitely think there's a there when it comes weighted with this like legacy and this history. Like that notebook, what was dated 1901, right? So 120 years old, which makes me ask the second part of my question is like, did this project make you think about how your music and your interpretations might be re-examined a century from now?
Absolutely. I think that I didn't think about it before. Somebody asked me, I had another interview around the time I was getting involved with this collective, and what are you proud of? And I said, you know what, I'm so proud of being part of this new project that the Autry is putting together, because instead of a Grammy to say Las Colibri won a Grammy that may sit in a place somewhere else, there's nothing better than to think that you'll be in a museum, an archive that will have made a difference about some information that somebody might want to go and look at years later. And I know now I have a whole different perspective of myself, making the parallels, making the connections to Manuela like I have. And I thank these women that are sitting in this panel today, because just someone like me, Susie Garcia, who loves mariachi music and is a Mexican-American little girl that grew up not speaking Spanish, but learned Spanish and tried to kind of pull my culture into myself and then share it out again, and trying to do these things in the community to make young kids and even older Chicanos understand that like our culture is important here. And we do have a bigger story to tell in Los Angeles. And I'm just so proud of being a Mexican American, and all these ladies helped me sort of raise me up and feel important and academic. And I can participate in something like this because I am, as Amy will tell you, I'm a culture bearer, and I have an important role in this life. And I have a lot of songs too. And I'm just like Manuela in many ways. And when kids or people can see themselves in others like Manuela, it's important. And I'm really just proud to be here and be Mexican American and be a woman and to share my story.
Yes, I hear you. I hear you on that. And that's why I became an archivist, right? It's just like, because I saw the history of the Filipino Americans that came for second wave, whatever. And I wanted to make that accessible. And I saw that in all my other, all the other people in my shoes like that. They're like first generation born from wherever. And they felt like they didn't see their history growing up. And then when they find that history, they hold on to it. And it's so important. I mean, it's like, that's why I feel like archive. And that's why I wanted this exhibit to happen. And I'm so tickled about this particular project because because I'm just going to say, like, archives are not, that people think they're dusty and passive. And yeah, they're this 2D flat, people think they're boring in a box, but it really takes the engagement of the people who created it, of the people who's documented, of the people who's associated it, to breathe this life and energy and create this new thing. And I feel that your work with Los Colibri and everybody's work just paints that so directly that you could see it. Oh, archive, swish, music, archive, swish, mapping, archive, swish, poetry, right? And that's how I see in shorthand how these historic documents can help. So with like the next swish of the other element that also where I saw this sort of breath into life into the archives was the work that you did, Amy. So I loved in your ASAP piece how you first set us in place, like how you were first introduced to the archives, first introduced to Manuela, I guess first introduced to Manuela through the archives and Los Colibri, and then going to La Fonda, which is another Los Angeles history. Like, so it was recorded in La Fonda restaurant, which is a LA landmark. So it wasn't until all of that were you then ready to write your poem. And that is how I feel like these pieces of evidence and experience come at you. And then it gives you that whatever fuel, fertilizer. I'm looking at your flowers to create. So
it is fuel and fertilizer.
So can you talk about that research, your archive research process? Is this the first time, the second time?
Yeah, I mean, before I go into the poem, I'll say something about, like, you'd asked me about, like, how do you interpret something? And it is a process of inquiry. We could call it rescate or restoration. But I just want to say to all the people in the room and to the people who are listening that this project, well, in addition to being a poet, I'm also an associate professor of arts management at Claremont Graduate University. So I really care about education, and I really care about institutional practices in the arts and culture. And this has been an amazing chance to see how when you change your approach and you change your perspective, you can change your practice. I think this is an example of changed educational practice, because here is Susie going over these songs and lyrics with her company who are younger women who she's mentoring. Here's Marissa bringing in Salvador and other of her students to translate the work and engage. And Janice and I have a relationship because she was once in 100 years ago my student. And it's this kind of a woman's way of mentoring over time that was so inclusive. And the fact that Britt was like, I'm not going to hold this all to myself. I'm going to share. I'm going to bring us together. And the fact that you were open to that story, I think it's an example of also changing museum practice. So big ups to all the educators in the room, but also to the museum for knowing that it's not just about objects, it's about practices and ways of working with knowledge. I just wanted to say that, since we're also want to raise resources for the museum. We're doing good work.
And I definitely have had a goal to get hands on the archives. And I think actually I shouldn't say I feel like I'm part of a movement that's happening in general. It's just like, get the hands on the archives, this whole like under glass approach. I know we're talking about exhibit, but this whole of don't touch that approach, just hasn't served us. So, and again, nothing really, to me, illustrates this in this project as of yet. So speaking of,
there's kind of like a, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, please, it's your time.
So one of the things that was important about this process is that this happened during a pandemic.
Yes.
And this happened with an ancestor. And whatever your spiritual framework is, I think we knew in our skin that she was arriving now. And even with me misinterpreting her handwriting, I'm seeing luta, which is in Portuguese, means struggle. And she's saying the dawn. This is about the dawn. It was this comforting vibe in the first page of her poem, of her writing, that was hitting us at a time when we were all terrified. And there's been a mystery about the whole process. We needed each other to fill in the different kinds of expertise to tell that rounded story. And I see, so the simple thing of writing a poem also does matter. I'll take a moment to talk about that. I see creativity as a process of research. It's inquiry. In the same way that we might think with the rational mind, oh, social studies, analyzing data, points, etc. It's a human cultural inquiry through the poetry. And one of the things I wanted to do in the poem was reflect our process. So in one of the lines of the poem, I call her alfabetizadísima, which is not really a word, but I say she is hyper alphabetized. No, that means she's super, super educated. Manuela, I give her that props. Alfabetizada means you know how to read and write, but I call her alfabetizadísima because that means you're really, really, really good at it. And that she carried the culture forward, which is what Susie's talking about. I am proud, I am a culture bearer, I bring my knowledge forward. I was writing her poem and I was like, I don't know how to do this. And I was like, oh, the poem needs a chorus. I don't personally write music. My son is a composer, I'm not. So then we read your butterfly cursive, hear your 100 canciones, qué hermosa eres tú, how beautiful you are. And we wanted to shine back love to her memory, and hopefully one day her family, when they realize that we've been digging into her archive and we reconnect too. I also took elements from the research that you might not grasp at first in the poem, that you could call it materia prima for color and texture. So for example, she sings of el sauce y la palma, so I include the willow and the palm. And we at the very end of the recording in La Fonda, which was really I will say it's one of the highlights of my life. Don't you think, Susie and Britt? That was really, really powerful. And Susie unlocked the door to that space for us. And that was really, really intense to be in that space with them singing. But we recited at the end after the recording, we recited her entire archive as if it was a poem. We didn't use it in the sound recording, but we have these women reading 100 songs, the names of the songs. And she has songs like Sama Cueca, Hippie Hoppa Hat, and then also the recording of Cara Negra. And so I use those words in the poem. Also, I brought in elements of the library research that we've been finding with LAPL, like Marissa talked about how her birthday parties were in the news. So in some of her birthday parties, it said that the tables were adorned with hyacinth and fern. And so I put hyacinth and fern in the poem. And I put in the names of the streets that we knew she lived on, like Olive and Spring. And then I also wanted to make the stance as an artist that she's carrying the culture in her body, that the archive is living in our bodies, and like Susie is an archivist in her body, a living archive in her music, in the same way the Autry has this other kind of an archive. So I said, dentro del cuerpo, body of metaphor, metáforas escrito a lápiz. So she was using her writing of metaphors, but she's carrying it in her body. And then I say that the bigger story is that her voice skips across centuries, right? And her sound circulates el espacio, expansive sonic territory, territorio abierto de pasado futuros, songs that continue to be sung. And I want to say to our friend who's on the telephone, Marissa mentioned the tech issue, Delia is listening with us on her telephone. So Delia, te mandamos un abrazo fuerte y eres una parte súper importante de ese proceso y te amamos. And, you know, the songs was skipping back and forth between all over the region. The songs were free, even if we had this silly structure of a border and a politics of a wall, the music was penetrating all of that to connect us. And then the very end of the poem is like a continuity. And actually it was the bottom, if you look at her page, the very bottom of the page, it says continúa, which means turn the page. But I use that as the end of the song, and I put together coro, continúa, which for me sounds like that children's game, Marco Polo. I don't know if you ever played that when you're little. Your eyes are closed and you go Marco, and your friends go Polo. And that's what this whole process has been like. Your eyes closed, you don't know where you're going, but you're calling out to each other. And that was the rhythm of the end of the poem.
Thank you. Thank you for that interpretation. When I was, reading and then seeing the final product, I was like, oh, it reminds me of those 1 act, 2 act where they describe the musical movements and then they play the music. We do have a question we have a couple of questions. One about any moment did you feel restricted in how much creative license you could take in the reinterpretation and exhibiting of that history? And we are, I do want to get to that La Fonda recording. So who can answer that in like a minute? At any moment, you got it? You got it, Britt?
Yeah. I just wanted to take a moment to say, I think creative license is hard. The women on this panel have shown us what archives can do and what archives cannot do. And while I love your question, I'm going to take it and make it a different one, because what do museums do? Well, we've kind of talked about it, but the Western imperial colonial project of nation building. And like, if you don't want to believe me on that, look at the Louvre, look at this work. It's a thing. So we've created museums to tell history's story. Just as we've kind of talked about, whose collection is the museum? Is it the public's? Because if it was, we wouldn't have had to use artistic creative inquiry and the Los Angeles Public Library and Janice's brain and Susie to get here, because we would have had it all in the museum. So I think that what creative licensing we have taken is that for 21st century storytelling, it should be world building. It should project into the future, and it should see realities that did not previously exist. And that's exactly what Versos y Besos was able to do with Manuela Garcia, who sat in the Autry's collection archive as an informant, but is a culture bearer and so much more. So yes, I think we should ask about artistic license, but I think we got way bigger problems with the field before we go there.
And I want to say that with archives, you bring out the raw material and the interpretation is to those who breathe life into it. And, come whatever that interpretation is, with very complicated, but, would definitely, I think there's a bit of that in there as well. We're coming on 6:23. I know we got a question I'm going to out her. Victoria Bernal has been an awesome complement to or asset to the What's Her Story Women in the Archives exhibit. She's managing our social media. So anytime you see social media or a blog story about the exhibit or our Women in the Archives initiative, it's written by Victoria. And Victoria, I will get to your question personally. I know you said this for everybody. What are some outstanding questions you still have about her? It was mentioned that we don't know what song she listened to. Where are other aspects about her life you'd love to know? And I think we'll type that to her because I do want to queue up the recording of Versos de Alba by Los Colibri in La Fonda restaurant. So you've got Manuela to Los Colibri to La Fonda, all Los Angeles culture bearer institution heritage elements. So Rob, I just looked over my shoulders as if Rob is right here with me. But Rob, if you can cue that up, that'd be great. Yay! I've listened to that recording. I can't even tell you a lot, and it doesn't get old. And that is a beautiful way to, I think, to end this conversation. Of course, we could have gone on forever. I can't wait for a time where I can actually maybe just, see your faces in person, because I can't stress enough how much I love this project. Thank you to Janice and Britt for bringing this together. Thank you, Marissa, Amy, and Susie, Janice, and Britt for joining us today for our artist conversations. And again, thank you all for taking the time to hear more from Versos y Besos. And please support more programs like these by filling out this survey on the webpage at the end of this program. I think we got a slide for you. Da, 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 da. Like I'm also going to be humming this song forever as well. So please support more programs like these by filling out this survey on the webpage at the end of this program and include the grant number and ID, which is HFA P19-55, HFA P19-55. Who has bingo? So thank you again.